With us as always, Jon Wertheim. Jon, you had a week off of the pod last week. What the hell did you do with all your time? You're traveling somewhere. I see a hotel room. Your wall in that hotel room looks like a Louis Vuitton bag. That looks expensive.
You like that?
It's fancy.
I'm in Copenhagen, Denmark, and if they didn't have good hotel decor here, they'll have it nowhere. I had to take a week off so Lindsay could spew profanities your way. That was a great interview. I enjoyed that. But I'm in lovely. Have you been here? You been to Denmark?
I've never been to Denmark. No.
Oh man, it's fantastic. Weather's great. It's riotously expensive, which is a little unfortunate, but it's a very it's a successful country, safety net. It's also a huge tennis country. Every conversation, everyone I've met, oh, tennis, I love tennis. Sometimes people say I love tennis, and the next line is like, Roger's so elegant. This is like, Yuri Leheshka is really hitting over his backhand. Has he changed his grip at all? I mean, these are hardcore tennis fans. This is a country of 6 million. They have, a former number one player in Caroline and a borderline top tenor in Holger Rune. They're very conflicted about Holger Rune. They love that he's this ascending talent, but his demeanor is decidedly not Danish. But great country, great tennis country. Put this one on your list, buddy.
And do you think this is the Wozniacki effect, or were these people all huge Kenneth Carlsen fans as well?
Yeah, it goes way back. We went here, buddy. Went a little digression here.
Yes.
Lars Ulrich, Metallica drummer Lars Ulrich, right? His father, Torben Ulrich, great guy, Danish player. Brad Gilbert and I got to know him. He passed away a few months ago, unfortunately. He was a great player. He also was this real eccentric who apparently he once missed a match because he found a turtle that he liked and he couldn't tear himself away from the turtle outside the locker room.
That can't be a real story. That story gets better with age.
Listen to this one. This is the best story. He plays Wimbledon. And in the middle of the match, he goes to his opponent and starts giving him a back rub. Opponent turns around, what the hell are you doing? And he says, I could see the stress across the net. I did not want to play an opponent who was feeling so much stress. So he gave his opponent a mid-match back rub. This was a real eccentric, great Danish tennis player. But, he passed away recently. I think, he was probably in his early 90s. So this is a tennis legacy that goes way back, a lot of indoor tennis. Caroline obviously helps. She's much more quintessentially Danish than Holger Rune. But everyone I've talked to here, are you following Madrid? I mean, these guys are hardcore tennis fans. Someone should put an event in this lovely country of 6 million people.
Do you know if Torben Ulrich was winning that match when he gave the guy a back rub?
I gotta look that one up because I actually have the name of the opponent written somewhere. I'm curious if that was a pivotal point in the match. If he's like, is he absolutely tuning the guy love, or is this a close match and he gave up a little mental gamesmanship there? But no, Torben Ulrich, one of the all-time great tennis characters. He was a poet. He was an artist. I don't know if you ever see I can't believe Some Kind of Monster, the Metallica documentary.
Oh yes.
He steals that movie. I mean, all these record company execs are like, oh my God, this is super amazing. You guys are incredible. And Torben Ulrich listens to the album and says, basically, boys, are you sure you want to be putting this art into the world? Are you sure this is the best representation of your band? I don't know how we're talking about Metallica on a tennis podcast, but Torben Ulrich, great tennis character.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say Metallica is going to be big one day. I think they got it right. I'm just, as you're telling the story about the back rub, I'm trying to decide whether I'd be more pissed about my opponent giving me a back rub if I was losing or if I was winning, and I can't make up my mind. It's like if you're winning, you're like, this guy's just throwing me off. This is some weird stuff. If you're losing, it's like it's pretty condescending, I think. I'm sure all with the best of intentions, but I can honestly say that I probably would not have reacted very well to that. And awkward transition. People who are not reacting well to the physicality of this tennis calendar. It feels like we're dropping like flies in Madrid. You look at. It's funny. You're seeing kind of these young players that are now having to grasp with the reality of not being able to do it all the time, right? And I think to the credit of probably more so Roger and Novak, and maybe a little bit less so Rafa. Later on in their careers, knowing when to put their foot on the gas as far as scheduling, but also scheduling isn't just tournaments. You have to schedule breaks and you have to schedule training blocks. That is how you avoid injuries, stay strong. Something's got to give. You can't just play or practice tennis 40 weeks a year. And also, Sinner hurt his hip, in the gym this week. Like, when you're playing matches in 2 out of 3 set matches, like, you should be doing nothing that can actually cause a hip injury. The rumor is, and take it for what it's worth, because I don't have an inside track on this at all. I'll tell you when I do, and I'll certainly tell you when I don't. It was like a heavy, like, lifting thing, like where it's like, okay, the times have changed where that's happening. But like, what's your take on this? I mean, we have Carlos with his arm, and now he's out of Rome. Sinner pulling out of a tournament, he's a fair bit in, and also ended Monte-Carlo with a bit of a cramp or leg injury. I wonder if it's a hip. We never got full clarity on that. If I had a hip injury and it caused me, I would probably just say I was cramping too, because I wouldn't want any follow-up questions. And then Medvedev, who never really complains about physical ailments. I hope it's a spasm, but it's a hip injury as well. It's a bit of an issue, I think.
Yeah, remember when these 2-week events, one of the great selling points was the players weren't going to have to play back-to-back days, and they were going to have an extra day of rest. And I don't think anyone likes these 2-week non-majors, but it's a little bit concerning when these injuries are happening at an event that's been spread out. In part, one of the rationales anyway was apart from extra sessions, which benefits the other side of the table. One of the great selling points here was that we were going to have these extra days and days off, and yeah, you're wondering. Novak may have figured this out by laying low. I want to go back to what you said before. I mean, I think we should talk at some point about the variety of injuries, which is a little weird too. You mentioned three of the top 5 guys, and they've got 3 very different injuries. But what you said about recognizing that you're not invincible here. I remember when early in my tennis playing days, a player once said, I used to go out and hit forehand serves and eat Cheetos, and now I've got to really deal with this shit. That player was Andy Roddick. I very much recall you going through this and sort of reaching this. There's this realization point where, look, my body's something that I've got to tend to, and when I'm got a live arm and I'm 18, 19 years old, life's great, but that doesn't last forever. What is that like when suddenly your body, your whole career is predicated on this thing, right? And suddenly it's starting to mount a bit of an insurrection, and you've got to realize that staying healthy is part of the gig here. What is that like as a player, that transition?
It's a tough balance. Especially I was someone who needed matches. Like I couldn't just show up at a slam and play well. I just couldn't do it. It's not the way. I'm not a ball striker. I'm not a natural hitter of the ball. I could throw heat, and then generally just tried to figure out a way to be effective after that. But I had 2 years. So 01 kind of breakout, play as much as you can. Every tour event that you get into, you start that year on a wild card program, which is just basically an entitlement. So I took as many as I could whenever I could. Kind of finished that year 14 in the world. The next year, finished 10 in the world, and then 03, 04, I won over 70 matches both years. And I think I won, 10 times those years, and you're playing deep in majors more often than not. And at some point it becomes a little bit untenable. I played a little bit less in 05, won 5 times. So it's, but also when you're competing for number one, like these guys are later on in my career, when it was very, very clear to all involved that I was not one of the guys competing for the year-end number one spot. It was almost a little bit easier because I had, been number one. I had won Master Series events. I had, won a slam. And so for me, whether I was ranked 5 or 7 made exactly zero difference to me. Like I didn't, it was fine. I just wanted to be seated in a certain slot for majors. Right. And that's kind of where my mind went. And so later on in my career, I was very, unapologetic about, I'm going to work as hard as I can in November. I pulled out of World Tour finals sometimes, to maintain health. And that's easier to do when you're 5 and not 2 competing for the year-end number one spot, right? But then I would go hard January through March. I would bake in a month to go home, reset, train, get stronger. And then I was like, okay, that's going to get me through, whatever I play on clay and the run through Wimbledon. And I kind of had to accept that there had to be pockets, especially I was kind of a big body physical guy. So I had to make sure the engine was running, but the trade-off was like I kind of was insecure. I'm like, I could be putting up, some points and I'm taking the 0, but you kind of had to play mental gymnastics that, this was how you raised the ceiling a little bit. But it didn't fit my personality. I'll tell you that much.
Right. So let me ask you this. How much of this is, hey, listen, man, we're not baking biscuits here. This is tennis. It's physical. It's sports. Every sport has an injury report. Well, will Damian Lillard play? No, he's hurt. I mean, injuries are part of sports. That's one extreme. And the other extreme is we've got a real problem here when we are, barely 4 months into the season and top players are not only pulling out, but doing it with a variety of injuries. How much is this, hey, listen, man, it's sports. This is part of the gig. It's bodies, it's physical. And how much of this is tennis really needs to address the fact that 3 of the top 5 guys after 120 days are nursing some pretty serious injuries here?
Well, here's the thing. So you can sell something however you want. Okay. So this thing with we're going to have days off, at these Masters 1000 events, days off in between, that's the okay. So, but the trade-off, if you add those up and all of a sudden we have, 5, 6, 7, 8 of these a year, that's that many more weeks that are taken, right? So I personally, and I, played well in the summer series where I, won back-to-back, Montreal, Cincinnati, did final semis to where you're playing 12 matches in 14 days and you're playing a lot of back-to-backs, okay? But the trade-off is all of a sudden, if you're not making those 2-week events, those weeks are spent at home resting and training as opposed to on site at a gym that's not yours. You're still spending nights with your head on a foreign pillow, right? So sure, there's more days off in between, but how many top players can't play 2 out of 3 sets days in a row? That's what we should be able to do that. And I'm not speaking of a place of projection. I had to do that and I did it and it's hard. Yeah, but sports is hard. I would trade off a day off in Madrid for a day off training block at home and think that is more beneficial to players' health. No question. Luckily, I mean, not luckily, but fortunately for the content of this episode, not a reflection on people getting hurt. Obviously, we don't want people to get hurt. Josh Dines, who was our Davis Cup doctor, his father was our Davis Cup doctor. He's been the doctor for the Mets, the Rangers, co-founder of a healthcare company called ViewFi, one of the top orthopedic surgeons on earth, is actually coming on as the guest this week. We're going to lead into him on TT, so you will see him coming up. But I'm curious to hear his take on load, time off versus. Hopefully we can get a better take on all of these answers. But as I'm looking through this, I think the number one chronic injury for tennis players, and especially in the afterlife, right? So you retire, you wait 15, 20 years, hips. Sinner's got a hip. Medvedev's got a hip. Agassi has bad hips. Jimmy Connors has full metal hips, to the point where it was humorous when he tried to go through metal detectors at airports. When we were traveling together, Guga Kuerten hips, Magnus Norman hips, Boris Becker hips. And it's not something you really, hear about because they're gone. It's not something you see. Bob Bryan, hip. Andy Murray.
There's a British guy they did a whole documentary on the resurfacing of his hips.
Andy Murray, hip. It seems like there's a trend, and Doc Dines will, I'm sure, have a more enlightened stance on the how and the why, but I feel pretty plainly that 2-week events don't provide more rest because it's the wrong kind of rest. It's a bullshit day in the middle of a tournament. You can win 2-2, you don't need a rest day, right? You just don't. We've done it forever. I'd rather have those stacked at home, being diligent, being on so Jannik Sinner doesn't have to do gym work during Madrid because he has that time to actually build at home. Now, me saying it's the wrong call for Sinner to do, their response could well be, when the hell else are we supposed to do it? Like, where are the pockets to actually do this foundational work? As we turn back the clock, does this feel like it's getting worse, or are we just paying more attention to it now?
It's I tried to scrape data on this, and it's really hard because you're not sure who's playing through pain and who's pulling out, and it's the data is really pretty dirty. But just, I mean, anecdotally, I mean, just go through the names, you talk to the players, you see players after matches. I think you're right. It's almost like these tournaments wanted to sell extra sessions and extra media time. And one of the things they did to appease the players was mention rest, but it's really not valuable rest. I anecdotally, I think it's pretty bad. And I think it's great that careers are getting longer. But boy, I mean, and I think you're right about hips. I mean, I think the other thing, you're right. You have an arm injury, but you don't necessarily see a lot of 45-year-old guys nursing an arm injury. You watch Boris Becker walk around Wimbledon, and it's painful. It's like it's like NFL old timers day. I don't know. What do you think? I mean, anecdotally, I think it's pretty bad, but it's hard to make the case with data.
The one thing that popped into my head was when you said, "Oh yeah, players are playing longer." I'm like, well, that would be the tournaments taking a lot of credit for like arthroscopic surgeries and diet and being able to afford teams, exactly. Like especially when there's no sample size and we started the longer events like recently. I don't think that's a valid argument at all. It's tough to take credit for rest days in Madrid and pay that forward to Novak not putting an ounce of sugar in his body for 20 years. Like, I don't know that. I'm not sure that's because they had an off day in Madrid. I think that is that's a bit of a reach.